My name is Paola. I work at the engine room and I will be facilitating today's roundtable. I would like to kick off just by saying a few words on today's topic so that we have a shared understanding of what we'll be discussing today. So how we define informed consent, as most of you probably know, varies in different fields and contexts, but typically there are three elements that are present. One is the voluntary disclosure of information. Two is a clear understanding of how the information will be used. And three is the capacity to make the decision in the first place and to give the consent itself. In the best case, the framework of informed consent allows us all to uphold the dignity for individuals and communities that are involved in the request at hand. That can relate to researchers, governments, aid organizations. For today's discussion, we will be focusing slightly on humanitarian sectors and those organizations. In recent years, however, we have witnessed data breaches. We've heard stories about international NGOs requiring, for example, that refugees share biometric data. And the framework of informed consent, particularly in the humanitarian context, is increasingly proving to be insufficient and difficult to implement in a way that balances both efficiency and also ethical challenges at hand. So at the center of the discussion today and beyond today as well is the question of whether communities being offered informed consent actually have the space to exercise agency and meaningful choice over how their information is collected and used. There's this quote that I love from our friend Dan Ingleton at Amnesty International, who wrote very clearly that recognizing the agency of the people that we work with means centralizing the experience of those people in our work. So we are joined today by four excellent speakers, whom I will introduce in a bit. Just a few final words on housekeeping. There will be plenty of time at the end of the discussion to dedicate to questions. So as Edmund has said, please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and your questions in the chat box, where Edmund and Maeve will also facilitate the stream of questions that we hope to see. So on to introducing our speakers. We have Stuart Campo of the Center of Humanitarian Data. We have Amos Doornbos of World Vision International. We have Frédéric Gibaudan of NRC, who is representing the CAMEALEON Consortium in Lebanon. And then we have one final speaker who is hopefully arriving soon, Victorien Hanché of the ICRC. I will allow the speakers to first say a few words about what they do and what they hope to share with us today. Stuart, would you like to kick us off with a short introduction of yourself?
Sure, thanks, Paula. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, so as Paula said, I work for the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. I'm based in the Netherlands, where we have part of our team, but we're a globally distributed team, and we are part of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs within the UN. My focus broadly is on data responsibility, and our function as the center, and really more broadly as OCHA, is looking mostly at the system-wide level at how we can support coordination, development of standards and guidance, and best practice in the sector on different aspects of data responsibility. So how organizations, both individually and collectively, approach this question, or probably these questions around informed consent, is really critical. And I think what I hope to both bring to the conversation and get out of the conversation today is some reflections on how we can collectively tackle this problem in a more consistent and effective way moving forward.
Thank you, Stuart. Amos, over to you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of you. as Paula said, I'm part of World Vision International. I'm part of our global humanitarian team. I look at kind of our systems and strategies that we use within our in our humanitarian work, in particular around some of our digital transformation work, and trying to help World Vision alongside of other sister agencies kind of think through data responsibility, how we make what technology choices that we make and how they align or don't align in some cases with our values as organizations, and how do we create space really for to enable conversations like these, but also conversations in organizations around the technology choices, and in particular the human side of the technology choices that we make, so that we create better awareness around what we're doing. And for this particular conversation, I hope to be able to bring some kind of practical questions and insights that we're trying to do and learning from, but also then hear from everyone else around different ways in which that we kind of enable people, especially on the front line of our work, to make choices around this particular topic, but other issues to do with responsible data.
Thank you. Frédéric.
Hello, thank you everyone. Thank you Paola and Edmond. So I'm working in the CAMEALEON Consortium in Lebanon. The CAMEALEON Consortium is composed of NRC, Oxfam, and Solidarity International. And CAMEALEON is monitoring WFP's cash assistance. So we are basically a third-party monitoring network. We are doing a lot of research, either with subcontractors or in-house studies. And one of our future studies, very soon, will be about the satisfaction of Syrian refugees on how their data was handled in terms of consent. I mean, when they look back to their consent a year ago, how do they feel about it? When we explain how the data was actually handled, with whom it was shared, etc., how do they feel about that? So we felt there was a gap in understanding Syrian refugees or refugees in general's perspectives on their data handling by the humanitarian actors.
Couldn't agree more. That's a huge gap, and I'm looking forward to reading the research. So our final speaker is Victorien Hanché, who was just joined us. Welcome, Victorien. Would you like to share a few words about yourself and your organization?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Sorry, I was a bit late. I had some issue to connect to the session. Thank you very much. I'm Victorien Hanché. I'm working for the Data Protection Office of the ICRC as a legal advisor, and my work is focused mainly on the assistance part of the ICRC. So what concerns medical activity, economic security activity, including cash transfer, GIS, water and habitation, basically voilà. And I've been part of the development of the first and the second edition of the handbook on data protection in humanitarian action.
Thank you. And thank you all for the introductions. It's time for us to move on to the meat of the discussion. We have a few questions that we'll be tackling here today. And to kick us off, quite a broad one, to understand your history and perspectives on informed consent. I want to ask our panelists, how has your understanding of the role of informed consent evolved over the years? Maybe to get a first non-volunteer to answer this question, I nominate Victorien because I'm particularly curious to hear how the ICRC, which is an organization that's been around for a while, how the position of the ICRC has changed over the last 2 decades as it relates to informed consent.
Okay, thank you very much. It's true that the position of the ICRC or the way we approach informed consent has very much evolved over the years. I mean, it's quite recent, so I would say the few last years, including since the GDPR entered into in force. So it's important maybe to remind to the audience that the ICRC as an international organization is not subject to GDPR. So we have a particular position, a specific position in this domain. We have our own rules and our own system of effective remedy. But it's true that actually we based our own rules on data protection on the GDPR, and we have informed consent as a legal basis, as a possibility for a legal basis. It's true that at the beginning we were using a lot of informed consent because for us it was the most legitimate legal basis, in a sense, or it was the one that would include the affected population the most. But unfortunately, with the time, with the understanding that we had on what is exactly informed consent, we realized that actually it's the information that is at the heart of the concept of consent. And information today, it's very difficult not only to understand, to have a formal global understanding on what is the information that we need to give, and how we can give this information. And I think it's really key to have a valid consent. Without this information that is complete and that is widely given to the affected population, we can't have a real consent. So that's why we started to move and from consent to other legal basis to process personal information. And basically today, only in rare case, we do not process on informed consent or on consent anymore, simply because we are not able, or we are not in a position to provide the right information. Simply because today the data, the data, the collection of the data and the usage of the data, the transfer of the data is becoming so complex that it's almost impossible to have a clear view and to be able to give the right information to the concerned person.
Thank you. It's a fascinating perspective. The complexity is indeed increasing. That's something that we'll also talk about in a bit. Would someone else like to share how their understanding of informed consent has evolved over the last few years? Feel free to raise a hand or wave. Amos, go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to. I definitely agree with Victorien that the complexity has definitely increased. I think it's important also probably to separate out kind of organizational understanding and kind of my own personal understanding of informed consent. Speaking personally, I'd say probably a number of years ago. In general, my response to informed consent was it was never possible or overly meaningful. And it was generally simply a compliance hoop that people or organizations jump through. I think over the years, working in it more and engaging in it more, and certainly engaging in conversations with others, it's really shifted away from probably the consent piece and much more to the informed part. And so doing a lot more, my understanding and my view is to think a lot more about how do we raise awareness about what it is that we're doing with the data that we're collecting, why, who we're sharing it with, all that kind of stuff. And really kind of checking then for understanding. And as that kind of, my evolution there, I guess in my views, has changed, it's also evolved much more into a duty of care lens, and trying to think about it and help others think about it as, this is something actually that we get to do. It's an opportunity that we have as individuals, as organizations, to kind of work with people who work, generally most of our organizations work with some of the most vulnerable people on the planet. We have an opportunity using kind of informed consent to help them understand what's going on better, to help raise their digital awareness, to learn together with them, not just by ourselves, but with them, kind of as we all kind of meander and kind of stumble our way through kind of evolving into this new world. And I think for me, that's probably the most exciting bit of it all, is that it's an opportunity to engage with the communities that we seek to serve around what is digital literacy, why do we need to understand this, what are we doing with this information. And I think so that's kind of, I think I've shifted much more to from impossibility to, and kind of meaninglessness to, this is actually an opportunity for us, and something that we get to do, not something that we have to do.
Right. So embracing the complexity that Victorien highlighted in a way. Stuart, how about you?
Sure, I'll be quick because I know a lot of other questions to get through, but for me, it's really two aspects. The first is that the reasons for which we need to think deliberately about informed consent in the sector have changed quite significantly based on the broader data landscape and its evolution. For me personally, the first instances that I experienced this about 12 years ago when I started working in the sector were more around research, not the delivery of assistance. And it was really around how humanitarians might be conducting evaluations or working with academics to come and conduct research in a particular location. And there was a disconnect between that data exercise and the receipt of assistance. And I think, at least in the more recent year conversations around informed consent, the real tension has come around the instances where provision of data based on informed consent or not is somehow a contingency in your receipt of assistance. And for me, that's a real complexity that brings this conversation where we are today. The other aspect is that it's not just a digital conversation. And I think I really agree with Amos about the opportunity that this process or step in the data management lifecycle presents to humanitarian actors, but this is not new and it's not uniquely digital. I think the digital aspects of the data landscape amplify the risks and the need to communicate those clearly to the people whose data we're trying to collect. But there's still a lot of analog data collection going on. And I've experienced, again, more personally than on behalf of OCHA, but I've experienced instances where digitally collected data is arguably more sort of up to standard than analog data. You might sit in an office and look at a sophisticated data collection system on someone's computer where there are paper files in an unlocked filing cabinet behind you that have beneficiary personal data on them. And so I think, again, we often lose sight of the analog when we move to the digital, and it's a spectrum and it's all of it. It's the data space, not just the digital data space, where this issue is really important.
Right, thank you, Stuart. Perhaps we might be better off referring to it as information to avoid that divide. But before we move on to the next question, Fred, I would love to hear your thoughts on how your understanding of informed consent has changed, particularly because, as you mentioned before, you've been knee-deep in empirical research on how Syrian refugees are responding to or are experiencing topics around consent and data collection. How has your understanding of it changed with that recent experience?
Yes, so at the beginning, as a European tech savvy, I was really careful for any service to ask my consent, and I wanted to extend these standards to the refugees in the field. But in practice, over the years, I've discovered by research, by my own research, but also by academic research, that informed consent is a very Western concept and comes from the habeas corpus, for those who remember it, and from individualistic philosophy where people choose for themselves. And in some cultures, this is not a thing. You don't choose by yourself. You do like other people do. It's a more collectivistic culture. It's less individualistic, of course, by terms of consequence. So sometimes it's not even requested by people, or it's not even something existent for people. And plus, I join Victorien on the fact that the information to be provided is endless, and we are often dealing in humanitarian action with people who are illiterate, who are very vulnerable, or even if they are literate, there is an asymmetry of power. They feel they are giving up on any will to hold on to something. They will just agree to anything, and sometimes they tell it, that they say it. Okay, let's cut the consent aspect of it. I will say yes anyway, whatever you say. So I think it's still, we still be careful on informed consent for the legal perspective, but we need a stronger ethics, because anyway, this informed consent, as far as we can do it, as good as we can do it, will never guarantee that the people who gave the consent was fully consenting or fully informed, etc. So we have to be careful by ourselves of what we do with the data, whether even if we got the informed consent.
Right. Thank you, Fred. The topics of context and culture and power are things that we will also touch on in today's discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
If I may, just before, something important maybe that we forgot in this discussion is, like, often also the collection of data is a condition to receive humanitarian aid. So from this point, we cannot really speak about consent when you are obliged, when it's mandatory to provide information to receive the assistance. It's more the case today, and I think it's important to underline this point. Sorry for that.
No worries. Absolutely. Power is very present in this conversation, and it's something that we should dig into as well. I'd like to talk a little bit next about something that Stuart already touched on, which is the definition of the data that we're talking about when we talk about informed consent. These are frameworks that are aimed to regulate, streams of data, but it's important that in the first place, our understanding of the information that we're talking about overlaps. So my question to the panel is, what types of information and data does the notion of informed consent cover or not cover? Referring, for example, to the analog and the digital Stuart mentioned. Stuart, would you like to say a few words first?
Sure, and the caveat being that I am probably least well placed amongst the panelists to speak practically about this, since OCHA does not do much primary data collection at all, and the type of data we typically deal with is non-personal data. But that being said, I think broadly, my understanding at least of the use of informed consent in the sector is quite specific to personal data. That being said, the ways in which that personal data might be aggregated and transformed at different levels, but still potentially be re-identifiable, is something we think a lot about at the center. And I would argue that, at least as part of the discussion around informed consent, we need to be thinking beyond the raw personal data and really making sure we're thinking about how that data is used in its various forms, even when anonymized, or at least seemingly anonymized. So I think it's not easy to draw a clear line between it just covers personal data, non-personal data, or group data, or demographically identifiable information is out of scope. I wouldn't say that is an easy line to draw. But I think one maybe different way to look at it is that the spirit of informed consent should apply broadly to all types of humanitarian data management activities. So even if you're not collecting personal data, if you're interacting with communities, getting their feedback, let's say, on services and never capturing personally identifiable information, you should still be informing. And I like Amos pointing out that aspect of it. You should be communicating clearly every time you interact with a population affected by crisis. Whether you're obtaining their consent in the now quite legal sense of the term is one aspect, but I think the notion more broadly should apply to how we think about everything we do with data.
Right. Thinking more about the interaction than the point of information, indeed. Amos, I know you've been doing some thinking about the types of data that this framework covers. How do you feel about what Stuart just mentioned in terms of the spirit of informed consent and the types of data that it covers or can not cover? Yeah,
well, I really like Stuart's terminology of the spirit, versus the letter, right? I think it's great. And that way, Stuart will probably steal that if that's right. In talking about that internally with our teams, because I think that's really what it's about. It's about the spirit of it. And I agree on kind of it's not about digital or analog, and it's certainly not just about what is legally classified as personal data. I think for me, it's about saying, great, there's lots of legal stuff out there, fantastic. That should be our baseline minimum. Like that's not our aspiration. That should be our minimum. And kind of moving beyond that, and kind of again, whether it's demographically identifiable, whether it's feedback data. I think OCHA's Stuart, I think it's the handbook, talks about different categories of data, and I think one of them is called uncertain sensitive data, which I really love that, because it's like, yeah, it really highlights, when we're talking about anonymous data, it's never really fully anonymized, right? It's more of a connect the dots exercise, where we may not be able to see it when we look at one data set, but put a bunch of data sets together and you start connecting dots and you can see kind of the picture. But I think for me, probably the one thing I would add was what I would love to see us do a lot more of is, again, engage in a conversation with the people about the data, or the people whose data we're talking about, and ask them. Right? We don't have to make all of these decisions ourselves. And actually, I think that we shouldn't. I think that there's really a space, again, to create where we engage with the communities themselves and say, what do they consider sensitive data? And maybe we'll get some insights about why. And maybe, yeah, it's going to take time to help kind of engage in those conversations. But I think it's really important to ask them, because they may say, look, like, well, this piece of data or this data field may not be legally considered sensitive. It's really sensitive to the individual or to the household or to the community. And I think it was Fred who was talking about kind of, it's not just about the individual either. And I think that's also really important to highlight and to think a lot about a lot more and engage in that discussion, so that the people that we're working with, also have a voice in deciding.
Interesting. Is the distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive data actually still relevant? Or should we move to considering all types of data as sensitive? Victorien, I see you're shaking your head.
Yeah, no, because I wanted to react exactly on this point. At the ICRC, after a few years of work in the field regarding the distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive data, actually today we consider at the ICRC, but it's a position of the ICRC only, that there is the distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive data is not relevant anymore. Simply, I mean, it's the same case for the anonymization of the data and the pseudonymization of the data. We cannot consider, I mean, for the ICRC, we cannot consider today that data can really be anonymized completely. Simply because the technology now today is so advanced that we have tools that are accessible for almost nothing on the web, that are easy to use, that actually we can data that are supposed to be anonymized actually can provide a lot of information on the people with like what is supposed to be data that are anonymized. I can guarantee you that I saw people being able to do crazy stuff with this data, and I actually identify the person behind this supposed anonymized data. It's the same kind of stuff with sensitive and non-sensitive data. Everything depends on the context. Certain type of data will be sensitive in a particular country or in a particular community. It will not be the case in another context. While it's the other way around. So we tend to consider that all data can be sensitive at some point, depending on the usage, the purpose of the processing, what we intend to do with the data, and yeah, how long we gonna keep the data. So basically we do not consider that there is a real distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive, because tomorrow non-sensitive information can become sensitive.
That's an interesting point. I think it's interesting to also consider the life cycle of data and how it can also change depending on time. So thank you. Next, I would like to dive in and discuss and focus on the informed part of informed consent. Amos, you touched on engagement quite a lot, and how informed consent requires engagement. We've seen some changes in how organizations are expanding their engagements when they try to inform the communities they work with. But what does that engagement actually look like in practice? Fred, I was wondering if you could share some examples of how you've seen informed consent happening in the field. How have you and your colleagues implemented informed consent in practice, and what are some lessons that you've learned or challenges that you've seen from that engagement?
Yes, indeed, it's a big source of challenges. So basically, we've gone the very straightforward way. We've followed guidelines and common sense, trying to be at the same time concise and exhaustive, which is completely contradictory. Trying to speak simple language, trying to offer a granular consenting to share their health data, consenting to be reached out to in future research, etc. So we the right way, let's say, between big quotes. And what happens is we are working in the context of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. They are living in collective housings most of the time, camps or construction sites with many families in it, and no one wants to be special. I mean, no one wants to draw attention. No one wants to be the annoying person in those contexts. So anyway, they will all consent to almost everything, and it's not taken very seriously. It's like something. It's like the paperwork you have to do for compliance, but nobody really cares about it. In consequence, the enumerators, seeing how the refugees don't really care about that, the enumerators themselves do not really care about that either, and they will pass very fast on it. So, I mean, in the end, do we have informed consent? Maybe sometimes yes, maybe sometimes no, and we can't even know when it's one or the other. And there are some exceptions. Sometimes people don't give their consent, so it's kind of a good sign. It's kind of a sign that it seems people have the choice. Usually, they refuse the consent before being formally asked. It's when reaching out by phone and saying, "Are you interested by a study?" They will say no for various reasons, but it will not be during the reading of the informed consent form. So, I mean, people will refuse or accept by themselves because they have good reasons to, and it's not really because of the choice we offer formally in an informed consent form. Yeah, so we are still looking for a way to have it truly rightly done.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's an exercise that is never ending. But thank you for sharing that experience. I particularly loved the way you mentioned that hearing a no or saying a no can actually be a positive thing within this framework. So thank you for sharing. Amos, I was wondering, how has the World Vision International?
Yeah. I mean, for me as an information management.
No, Fred, go ahead.
Sorry, it's lagging. Yeah, I said it's good news for me because my colleagues who are in the program, they are desperate when there are too many refusals, and I'm the only one to find that.
We seem to have some connectivity issues. So we didn't hear the last few things you just mentioned, Fred. Sorry about that. I hope it's the connection lines up again.
I don't know. Do you hear me?
Yes, this is better. Great.
Okay.
So thank you for sharing. Amos, I wanted to ask you, since you've been doing so much thinking about engagement and informing communities, how have you and World Vision tackle this challenge of engaging with communities in practice. Could you share some examples of how you've seen it done, or how you've done it in ways that are new and or innovative?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paula. Certainly, it's an ongoing challenge, and we're continuing to tackle it. I really like Fred's point about kind of language. I think language is so critical. You know, I often use the example of Starbucks, kind of outside of our context, obviously, but if you click on the kind of learn more, you get 20 pages of legalese, which is meaningless, right? So language is so important. Some of the things that we've been trying has been, you know, how do we present it? So how do we be creative, and how do we how we communicate? What are we talking about, or why do we need data? And you know, we've done, everything's a work in progress. Some of the things don't work, you know, and sometimes they work better than others. So kind of with that caveat, we've tried things like SMS engagement with people. We've tried IVR, especially recently with COVID. We've been trying some stuff with IVR. You know, we've even tried some things of the old school banners and pamphlets. In one context, we tried a voice recording of a community leader that then the individual who was collecting the data could kind of play out. In one case, they even tried a sound truck. I don't think that worked very well, but that was something that was tried. And then I think what we've also been exploring is how do we target specific, almost like focus groups of more vulnerable people within communities to try to, again, give them a space to have a conversation. And yes, one of the things, again, kind of, it's the checking of the understanding when people actually refuse consent. It's a double-edged sword. So what we have certainly found is, on the one hand, someone like me gets really excited when people say no. I think, yeah, fantastic, it's great, because I think that is an indication that there's a certain level of awareness reached. The flip side of that, and this was completely unexpected, but I forget, one of the other panelists mentioned it earlier, it's the notion that the data becomes a requirement for aid. So it's not really optional. But then when some people have said no, we also have a number of our staff then who try to ensure that the people still can receive aid. So it's not about trading data for aid. It's about saying, actually, the humanitarian imperative needs to come first. So we need to figure out a way to still deliver aid to these people. But the flip side of that, what then started happening is that raised a flag about fraud. It's like, oh, well, why are you handing out aid when you haven't collected that data? Yeah, and it's created some problems, and we haven't worked out solutions yet. There's still an ongoing process, but those are some things that we've been trying, and some of the learnings that we've had. Some things has gone well, others not so well. But.
Thank you for sharing, Amos. I'm curious, the pressure or the questions about handing out aid without, I guess, receiving the data. Who do these questions come from? Is it donors? Is it an outside partner? Audit.
Yeah. So kind of, you need, yeah. So then it usually gets flagged up during audit, and there's a part of that, right? Is this balancing act where we want audit to perform a function to help us identify when fraud is happening, but how do we do that and still fulfill the humanitarian imperative when the other part of the triangle is, yeah, generally donors, but also our organizational systems and policies say, oh, we must have data. We must have more of it, so you need to collect it. And this is where I think, again, other panelists have mentioned it, it's that it's the need for the questions of why. Why do we need the data? Because we don't actually need the data to hand out the aid. So what do we need the data for? And trying to kind of have more conversations about, well, what is the actual purpose of it? Which, yeah, opens up some interesting discussions.
It definitely does. Would any of the other panelists like to react to that statement? Victorien?
Yes, if I may, thank you very much. No, yeah, Amos, I really agree with you. In particular regarding audits and this need that seems to appear that we absolutely need data, and in particular a lot of range of data. Sometimes data that makes no sense for the people working in the field. Where we have colleagues asking us to collect political opinions sometimes, or I don't know, data that makes no sense for the purpose of the program. So sometimes, yes, I think we need really to work on raising awareness among our colleagues on the risk that we have when we collect data. For me, I mean, it's my personal opinion, but from the moment you create information digitally or on paper, you create a risk. So the less data you collect, the less risk you create. So there is no need to collect more and more and massive amount of data, because at the end you're gonna have an issue. So the less data you have, the better, in a better position you are. Then I wanted to say that it's also to answer to, I mean, partially answer to some of the question that we have in the chat. Maybe people seems very attached to consent as a legal basis. But actually, the GDPR or national laws on data protection, most of them, if not all of them, offer other possibility to collect data, other legal basis to collect data. It could be the vital interest of the person, the affected population. It could be the legitimate interest of the organization to collect data. And that's where the information, the key, this information elements may differ, because when you go on informed consent, there's not only impossible to put in practice, very heavy for the staff in the field. You have to provide all the information that will allow the person that will receive the information to fully understand the benefits and the risk that is involved in the processing of the processing of the data, which is almost impossible even for us at home. I mean, when we download an application on the phone, when we use our own computer, even if nobody reads them, but if you read the term of use when before clicking on download, I won't understand, even myself, I won't understand what is exactly going on behind my screen. I'm not sure exactly what my iPhone is doing right now. For example, maybe it's registering my conversation, and Apple is using this information to improve Siri. I don't know. So what can we say? What can we explain in terms of digital literacy to the people that are vulnerable? So that's why we prefer to process on other legal basis when the information stay. But the big difference between the two, between consent and other legal basis, such as vital interest, such as legitimate interest of the organization, is like the responsibility is not on the shoulders of the affected people, the beneficiaries, because in consent the responsibility goes directly in the shoulder of the person that received the information. On the other, when we use other legal basis, the responsibility stay on our side, on our shoulder, if I can say. And so that's why we're gonna provide information, but we're gonna provide information in a lighter way. We do not need to provide the full detail of the information, because actually it's on us that the responsibility is gonna stay. So we're gonna provide information, but in the most easy way, if I can say. And at the end, of course, the responsibility and the work goes. Somebody doesn't hear me, Fred?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. The work after then is on the organization. And what I wanted to say is like how we provide this information with this lighter organization information. Sorry, we at the ICRC we use many ways. When we have a crowd, we use oral dissemination. So with a mic, for example, we use posters sometimes, massive posters that we present in a particular area. We use form that we gave to the affected population. We use also registered, like on the COMBOX, on the mailbox, when people call our hotline. So there is many ways to give this information, but I think we should try to avoid to stay attached too much to the consent, because I think today I will not say that consent is completely dead, because in some circumstances we should try to do the most to go towards consent, but will the evolution of the technology and when I see where we go today, I think consent will become in a few years an utopia, or yes, it will be almost impossible in practice. So that's why we should today focus on other legal basis that offer the GDPR and choose new approach in the distribution of the dissemination of the information. So it was a bit long, but I think it was important to mention that.
Thank you, Victorien. I think it is an interesting question, and I think in the interest of time and to leave time for other questions, we'll move on to one question about harm, related to what you just mentioned, Victorien. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Helen Nissenbaum, but she's written that the farce of consent, calling it a farce, currently deployed, is probably doing more harm than as it gives the misimpression of meaningful control. And I think that is something that touches on quite a lot that you just mentioned, Victorien. So I would like to spend some time discussing the harm that may or may not be done when deploying the framework of informed consent. Are we actually achieving informed consent, and how do we know that we are or are not achieving it? What are some current frameworks for evaluation, if there are any, and where are we lacking, and how are we even evaluating what is working and what is not working? Any volunteers, Victorien?
No, but I spoke a lot already, so I don't want to take the floor all the time. So I don't know if my colleagues want to speak on that.
Well, I'm happy to.
Stuart?
Hi. Again, sort of recognizing that this is not based on OCHA's direct experience, but I think something that we do a lot of in the sector that could be a nice analogous process to what monitoring and evaluation of informed consent could look like is knowledge, attitudes, and practice surveys, right? So we do baseline surveys of people's understanding of certain issues, their awareness and access to information about them, and then how they perceive that issue in their community. It could be interesting to start to do these types of studies around how people think humanitarian organizations are processing their data and how that relates to the delivery of assistance. I mean, we talk a lot about being people-centered. That's the theme of this entire conference this year. We talk a lot about making sure that the design, not just of informed consent, but all aspects of data management are really keeping people in the center and keeping them involved. So why don't, I mean, let's ask, right? And maybe NGOs are doing this or UN agencies are doing this and I just haven't seen it, but it seems like a kind of obvious, maybe too close to us to see thing that maybe we should start to ask. Something that I worry about and something that is closer to the role that OCHA should be playing is the inconsistency in informed consent or other legal bases, frankly, that affected populations might experience in a given context. So if you're in a high complexity and therefore high traffic, for lack of a better term, aid environment, and you have 4 or 5 different NGOs plus a few UN agencies delivering assistance in your community, that may mean 4 or 5 different household interviews where your data is collected at various degrees of detail. And that may mean 4 or 5 different conversations about whether or not you consent to having that done and the relationship that that has in you receiving assistance. And I think looking at that in a pretty micro way, and then understanding how we are or are not converging on some common best practice would be really helpful to then help us think more collectively about how to approach this in a safe, ethical, and effective way.
Thank you. Fred, actually, you've been doing this work of evaluating the success or the failure of informed consent. How did you first tackle the question? What are some metrics that you use to start to evaluate whether or not this framework is working in the context of Syrian refugees in Lebanon?
No, unfortunately, I haven't been doing that work, but I'm planning to do it. So yeah, I mean, COVID has delayed a lot of activities for everyone, I guess. So yeah, we are first doing some literature review. And by the way, thanks for all the links you shared during the preparation, because I've already started looking at them, especially at the engine room. And this philosopher you mentioned, I can't remember her name, but I've already started reading her paper and about the force of informed consent, etc. So I mean, we have seen some tentatives from Lebanese researchers in the context of Palestinian camps in Lebanon, and they tried to thoroughly explain what the data processing would look like, and it was very long, and it was purposely very long. It was 20 minutes of explanation. But it was not a preliminary thing to another study. It was the point of the study. And even in that case, people would just get very annoyed by it and say, okay, cut it, and I will say yes anyway. So this is one of the first, first things I saw in the context I'm working in Lebanon, indicating that all our standards are maybe not relevant. And so another thing I would like, another metric I would like to put in place, at least try to put in place, is the backward look on consent. So because it's very easy to give a consent, as Victorien said, I mean, even in the West, we have not managed informed consent. We are all ready to sell our privacy to be allowed to crush candies without even reading what it's about. So let's imagine what it is for very vulnerable people who are who are just willing to survive, of course, they will give their consent even more than we do. So for us, it's not informed consent. So for them, it's even worse. So maybe having a backward look after the activities, like we do with satisfactory questionnaires after food delivery or NFI delivery. Maybe we could do a satisfaction questionnaire about the data, about how the data was handled, about the information people received on the processing of their data, about whether they regret to have consented, or about whether they don't care at all about that because they have more important priorities. Which would, I mean, I'm expecting some kind of answers like this. We have more urgent thing to think, and which for me should not deter the NGOs of being careful about the data processing, but it should improve it, on the contrary, because people have other priorities, and it's totally understandable. So we have to take care of it for them.
Thank you, Fred. I have a related question. It's true that this work of evaluation is not being done in every organization or as often as it should be happening. But for those that are doing it, we don't often see it being published. We don't often see organizations talking about their failures, especially when it relates to the processing of data. And I was wondering if, I know Amos, you talked about this on a recent webinar. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on how you hope organizations will share failures related to informed consent, or challenges that they've faced. And I know that there are a lot of assumptions in my questions, so feel free to to disagree.
Yeah, how do I hope organize? Well, I think that in order for us as a sector to learn and to get better, we have to be able to talk about when things go wrong, and things go. And we have to be able somehow to have the conversations in a way that acknowledges and deals with the fact that everyone feels an enormous amounts of shame when things go wrong. It's part of being human. And I think also every organization has done things or has had incidents of things go wrong, that they're not proud of. And of course they're not proud of it. But we have to create spaces in which that happens. And yes, maybe there is a place for complete and open kind of public commentary on it. But often when it goes very public, it becomes a naming and shaming ritual. And I'm not always convinced that helps, or that that's what's needed right now. And so I think on the other webinar, we talked about how do we create space? How do we create colleagues in our own organizations? So how do I have some colleagues where I can talk to about where things have gone wrong? But also, and maybe it's, I know some people in other organizations, and it is private. And I think this is the difficult piece, is that at the beginning, a lot of those conversations are going to be private. But if we're having them, and if we kind of can create space again for them to occur, potentially over time, we start to kind of bubble up, and it becomes a little bit easier to talk about it because we've reduced some of the shame involved. But I think it's really hard. I think what other Stuart, I think, was touching on it, and Fred a little bit as well. This evaluation space as well is asking some questions. And this, we're starting to explore this a bit, or have some. How do we ask questions around? Have our internal practices, have we changed in what we do with the data because of the conversations around informed consent that we're having with communities? Have our practices even changed, or are they still exactly the same? We've just added an additional step. And we don't know. We're hoping to try to add that into some of our evaluations in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to share some of that in the years to come. But I think where we're at today is it's difficult to go from complete closed door discussions to complete transparency and openness. And maybe sometimes we even need to ask, is complete openness and transparency when there's data breaches, or when there's, when things go wrong? Does that help, or does that just kind of shut people down even more? I don't know, but so sorry, Paula, that was my rambling.
No worries. I didn't expect you to solve the problem right here and right now. I think that would be too much to ask, but no, I think you're definitely right in keeping the finger on the pulse when it comes to making sure that we are not only in our discourse learning about the challenges of informed consent, but that we also can tell that organizations are operationalizing these learnings and changing practices for the better. So before we move on to questions, I have one final question for the group. It's a very broad one, so feel free to say you don't know. But I wanted to look ahead and look to the future. What do you hope is next for informed consent and humanitarian action? Would anyone like to go first? No hands?
Sure, I can start us off just very quickly. For me, my hope would be that the conversation around informed consent helps us as a sector kind of to move from compliance to thinking about it from a duty of care lens, and to see it as an opportunity to raise awareness with the people that we seek to serve, and to improve digital literacy among them and ourselves. I think that many of our organizations represented here, and the ones on the, through participants, humanitarian organizations often have long-term relationships of trust with communities. It's one of the things that one of our USPs. And I think, look, to me, it's an opportunity again to embrace the USP and build on it, and try to overall improve kind of digital literacy, as well as data, and to Stuart's point, beyond just the digital part, but also kind of the data literacy in whatever format it happens to be.
Thank you, Amos. Stuart?
Sure. I think a couple key aspects. One would be more clarity on how informed consent is still being used, and maybe really honing in on this understanding of the different use cases in which organizations are still seeking informed consent. To my earlier point about this being very much still embedded, rightfully so, in humanitarian research as part of how human subjects are engaged, but then the kind of confusion and complexity of it being more common as part of what I would refer to as operational data management that's tied to the delivery of assistance. So that would be one, just maybe looking at a couple of response environments and seeing very practically within that environment, or even within a subsector of that environment, an area like cash or the delivery of NFIs or something quite specific, how this is being done. I think the second would be more global, perhaps, but also still response level quite relevant, recognition that this could quickly become a race to the bottom if organizations start to move away from informed consent and focus on other legal bases without bringing along the positive impacts that caring about informed consent can have on how populations understand what we're doing with their data, on how they see their own agency in the humanitarian data ecosystem, I think is something to keep an eye on. And this becomes very micro level in many ways, because if one actor in a response environment is continuing to use the language of informed consent, and even if they're doing that well, that can create new trust or distrust dynamics for that same population with other humanitarian actors. So unfortunately, like most things in the sector now, this is a collective action problem, and we need to have clarity on what's happening and then look at where the potential pitfalls are together in order to address them.
Thank you, Stuart. Very interesting points made about the impact of informed consent processes done well or not so well. Fred, would you like to share some words on what you hope is next for informed consent in humanitarian action?
Yeah, I totally agree with Stuart. And yeah, I mean, as Amos and Stuart said, I think it's important to keep informed consent at the same time for raising awareness among the people we seek to serve or among the humanitarian workers, and to keep asking ourselves if we really need that data, etc. Of course, for compliance, because it's important to have protective laws and to try to abide by those laws. I think there may be also a dimension, maybe if it's small, I don't know, there may be a dimension of empowerment. I mean, we're asking the people in need, the vulnerable people, to decide, even though it's kind of a deception. I mean, I think we all agree it's not the informed consent is, I mean, yeah, it's said to be a farce or a joke by some. I mean, we all agree that it's not something that is mature, it's not something that is effective, but at least we are asking vulnerable people's opinion on something, and we are asking them to engage. So yeah, so this could be another positive aspect, but it would be lying to let them believe that that they have full power on the data processing. So it could also be some contradictory. And anyway, I think as a humanitarian worker, compliance, I mean, whether with consent or any other kind of law, compliance should not be our horizon. I mean, compliance is to mitigate hostile behaviors or negligent behaviors from actors, from economic actors, etc. As NGOs, we should be far ahead of that. We should follow the principles and aim at the highest level of protection.
Thank you. So coming back to the duty of care that was mentioned at the very start of the conversation.
Exactly.
Fred. Victorien, how about you? What do you hope to see in the future?
Yes, maybe to add something a bit different. Today we would like actually to use informed consent, despite what I say from since the beginning of this discussion, because I think it's the consent is fundamental for the people. But today the way the law is drafted, or at case many laws are drafted, it's impossible in the context of humanitarian action. So I would like to launch a call to lawmakers, maybe, to make it practical for humanitarian organization and for humanitarian action as a whole, for maybe one day being able to have to use the real consent of the people without being in a state of in a position of where we actually lie to ourselves by saying that we got the consent of the people, but I think it's not our responsibility anymore. Today, what we can do, it's find alternative solution, like other legal basis. But of course, our aim one day it's to be able to use consent. But no, it's not between our hands.
Thank you, Victorien. I think that's also important. We haven't really mentioned other actors outside of the humanitarian world, but of course they also impact the way that we look at compliance, regulations, and then can go beyond that. So thank you for that, Victorien. So we have I have some reading here that hopefully you can visit. Some of our speakers have written about informed consent, and as Victorien has mentioned, there is also a second edition of the handbook on data protection and humanitarian action. So I invite you all to read it. I have a copy of the first edition on my desk, and it's a very interesting one. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. I know that there have been a few of those in the Q&A panel, so I would like to ask Edmond and or Maeve to facilitate a few of those. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can also look at the questions. But yeah, Edmond, do you want to share the first question for the panel?
If you want, I can do that. There's a question of any example of successful incorporation of the part of informed consent when one can request to delete one's data. This is from Jana. We tried to incorporate it from a comms perspective, but it's not easy because of staff turnover.
Interesting question. Would anyone like to start? Amos?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Jana. I think, yeah, I don't have real specific successes. We've tried it in many different cases. Often the struggle that we have, especially when it's digital, has been how do we entangle it from where it's gone. And so it's fairly easy to kind of delete it, let's say at a very specific project level, but then there's an entanglement that happens with that data. There was one case with a particular donor they wanted all of the names of the individuals as well. So trying to kind of get it back from them, proved unsuccessful. For various different reasons, and even in some of our own internal systems, kind of I like the notion of the thread, because it just kind of unraveling this sweater took a long time, and we really struggled with it. But it's something that we're continuing to work on and trying to figure out better ways to kind of contain the data in certain locations so that we can do that better.
Paola, I can't remember which organization it was, and if I did, I probably wouldn't say anyway, but there's a story in lore in the sector, and probably this has happened many times, where a family had consented initially to have their picture taken and used in an appeal document, and then later requested that image no longer be used and no longer be presented on various documents. And this forced the organization to go and basically redact that image from public materials, which of course was quite a headache, but a good thing to do based on the request from the people whose photographic data they were using. And I think just because the question mentioned communications, it's interesting again to look internally at humanitarian organizations and how this is really where informed consent probably entered the humanitarian world first, was using images of people in different ways. And the way in which consent was obtained very deliberately and still is obtained very deliberately by communications staff. Maybe because it's more visible. And I think it's worth humanitarian organizations reckoning with that question. Photographic data is very easy to see how it's used, right? If it's on a billboard or a PDF or a social media campaign, whereas data that I give you in a household survey is a little harder to sort of follow the thread on, to use Amos's metaphor. So is it because we are seeing that we're more careful with that type of data, or is it because it's for us also easier to follow and therefore kind of control the future uses of? I think it's worth organizations asking that question.
Paola, do you want to move on to another question?
Yes, I can see them now. Thank you for sharing them. So thank you for the panelists for answering that first question. I see one here about alternatives to informed consent. What are the alternatives to informed consent that can be used as an alternative legal basis? And can you give a concrete example? This is something that we touched on earlier. Victorien, you want to continue how you started answering that question in one of the questions?
No, but I think that the GDPR on one side and the national legislation on the other side provide enough legal basis to process personal data. It's true, it's not consent, but we have the vital interest of the person affected. We have the legitimate interest. The public interest as well to process personal information. So I think today we have a panel of alternative that exists to process personal information, that each of them have some sort of condition to be applicable and to be to be usable in the field, in the operation. Maybe, but again, it's my personal opinion, it's a bit light and short. Maybe we may need other legal basis to use to be able to process personal information. But again, it's if lawmakers, if other organizations or other parties, other entities are capable to tackle the issue of legal basis and the processing of personal information in the context of humanitarian action, if one day the debate expands, maybe we will have more solutions. But it's true that the ICRC use regularly vital interest or legitimate interest as a legal basis to process personal information. It does completely legal and lawful.
Thank you, Victorien. We have time to answer one question. It's a big one, but I think that it's also one that will benefit our people joining here who also work at humanitarian organizations. So the last question to the panelists: what would be your recommendation for NGOs who often do not have the budget to spend on consent activities? Oftentimes, big donors do not allow the budget lines for this. They all say they want this, but then refuse to give us the means to spend time on this. So to sum it up, what would be your recommendations on 2 or 3 concrete things to do which have a high return on investment? What should they focus on a minimum when they don't have the resources to ensure an ideal informed consent process?
I would just say one thing and then leave the floor to my colleagues. I would say that again we come back to the topic of raising awareness. among the organization, but also towards the donors and the people giving funds to organization. I think today people in the streets, organization, big companies, they all understood, or they are understanding, they are in the course of understanding that data protection is now a key element of our work, and we cannot do without data protection, and we're gonna need money, we're gonna need funds to be able to respond to legal obligation, because actually today they are legal obligation. So we cannot really say that we don't have funds, so we cannot comply with our legal obligation. So I think it's again a question of raising awareness among our partners.
That's an excellent point. I think we have to be clear to when talking about the necessity of ensuring that we have proper processes for informed consent, and then that requires budget, of course, and resources. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session. I would like to thank everyone for sharing their interesting questions. The panelists have also been invited to answer them in the chat. So stick around, they might get around to doing that. And then the last thing that's left for me to do is thank everyone, thank all the panelists, thank Maeve, Edmond, the whole team at GONG, and everyone joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and I hope to continue the discussion either on Twitter or as one of the next events at GONG today and tomorrow. So thank you all, and I hope that you have a lovely day and the rest of the event.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.